My pleasure. My pleasure.
Here, let me.
You,
Wait a second.
my power source. I want to make my power run out. So
Give it a second. I gotta do a couple technical stuff here.
that's good. I need a second as well, so that's okay.
Okay.
Hold on.
Neil moved too fast. I wasn't ready either. So give me a second here. I'm getting it all set up on my end.
That's good.
Okay. Getting your first pick ready. Oh, that's a good
Looking
looking
for
man.
my
Okay.
looking for a picture and I can't find it. Damn it! Damn it!
Okay.
Hold on one moment. I have to move this over.
Just putting some advertisements, future adult eds coming through here. Okay. And that's the to-do list. Okay, we're just getting all of our technology in a row here. Thank you, Bernice. October 3rd, first Monday is the Jewish world of Alexander Hamilton. Nice. Okay. Okay, just practicing here. We're ready. So Neil, if you look in the chat box, you have the future adult eds. You've got our upcoming adult eds. Tonight is Yom Kippur War. Saturday morning, we have the new prayer book adult ed. On Monday, August 22nd, we have the 9 Jews. On Thursday, August 25th, we have great questions. And then on August 28th, we have intro. And then October 3rd, we've got the first Mondays. So it is all in your chat box. How's it going, Jake?
It's okay. I'm having a little trouble with my computer screen. Hold on one moment. As usual.
You can send it to me. I'll put it up there.
No, that's not the problem. I need it up in front of me, and I can only just one moment on that, but I'm almost ready.
Take your time. It's 7:34, so it's kind of early for us.
Yeah, we're doing okay. I realize.
And we got people coming in already. Hello, Irv, Alva, Bernice, Bonnie and Michael, Ellen and Richard, Georgia, Carol and Len, Edie, Shelley, Harold and Deb. What do I just got there? We got Bob and Carol, Linda, Sheila, Ed. What's that?
The end of Romper Room. The magic mirror. The host of Romper Room at the end of Romper Room would look in her magic mirror and say the names of all the boys and girls she saw.
They were ahead of their times.
Yes. She didn't really see them. It was like, and she never said Jacob because my name was dead as a doornail when I was a kid. And then when I was in college, I started noticing all these grade school kids named Jake and Jacob. And all of a sudden I had the again.
Yeah, I was the first Alex, and then all the kids getting in trouble were named Alex. So, Now I don't have a lot of Alexanders again.
Yeah. When it comes to boys' names, usually people start naming their dogs, like, and then becomes an actual human's name. And then with girls, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure.
I just met someone who named their cat David. I just find it interesting when you name a human name, like your cat's name. What's your cat's name? It's David. You good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Oh, then stop talking to me. I'd rather hear you. That's it. Get started.
All right, Neil, you want to?
I think, Neil, do you want to talk more?
I don't have anything else to say if you're ready, Jake. I mean, I do want to emphasize everybody, there's a lot of rescheduled things. So please, unfortunately, we've had some deaths in our synagogue that's kind of forced us to reschedule. So everybody look at the chat box for 9 Jews, great questions, and intro to Judaism. And I think I'm set. I know it's hard to believe I'm speechless these days, but are you good, Jake? Are you still setting up? All righty, take it away, sir.
So it makes sense to make this the final lecture, because the Yom Kippur War is the final real major war with real armies, not terrorists, not paramilitary, you would say kind of conventional war between Israel and its neighboring countries. Some of that's good, that hasn't happened again. Some of it's bad, though, because starting from a little bit even before the Yom Kippur War and then up until today, the threat of terror, the threat of attacks from smaller military groups, that kind of thing, lives on. If you attended the other 3 lectures that I've done, I like to set the scene a little bit before I say, well, the war breaks out. I like to set the scene a little bit. And really you have to start with the end of the 1967 war. Remember when we last got together, the 6-Day War had ended. It had been a resounding victory for the Israelis. And along with that victory comes the acquiring of new territory. The entire area west, for the West Bank, west of the Jordan River, and more importantly for our specific discussion, and the Golan Heights, more importantly for our discussion, the Golan Heights bordering Syria and the Sinai Desert to the south. And what happens, we all know what happens from a emotional standpoint. Israel is really a big hero in the world. There's a lot of celebration going on, but Israel doesn't stand pat. They decide that for all intents and purposes, the biggest military threat remains the Egyptians. And so if you want to take a look at the first link, I have a picture of the chief of staff of the Israeli army at the time. And his name is Chaim Bar-Lev. You see a picture in there. Handsome dude, strong looking guy. There's something about, and he actually was a good general, obviously, but there's something about generals in history. The better looking they are, the worse they tend to be. I think of people like Wesley Clark in the United States and some of the handsome people. It seems like, you want a tough looking guy like Patton or, but all joking aside, he decides to make a really bold plan for Israel, something that they had never done before. And he starts working on something that eventually got named the Bar-Lev Line. And the Bar-Lev Line is basically a series of fortifications along the east coast of the Suez Canal and in other parts of the Sinai Desert that really look like they're pretty impenetrable. Like, this is like a really good move, it seems like, for everyone who isn't an historian, that is, because a lot of people after the war started to make comparisons between the Bar-Lev Line and the Maginot Line, which the French thought would protect them after World War I from invasion from Germany and other places like that. So you can take a look at a picture. There's some pictures of what the Bar-Lev Line looked like. This is the second link. And it included a lot of different things, things that you would normally think would work, like fortification, like little forts, little bunkers. But what was considered to be the most ingenious thing were these deep, you see these cavernous areas here where you got to climb through these trenches, and they're fortified by these big sand dune walls that the Israelis, do you say you build a sand dune? No, I mean, they put it together to make it very, very hard to scale for humans or tanks or anything to scale. And it looked pretty impenetrable. So this is what Israel is doing. They're spending a lot of time trying to protect their new territory, trying to protect the homeland of Israel. And that's what they're working on. And in the north, I'm not going to tell you yet what they were doing in the north to protect themselves from Syria, but I'll get to that a little bit later in the lecture, because this is a more important thing to focus on right now, because this was really something that Israel worked on and took much more of an effort. The fortifications in the north, again, I'll get to it because I want to leave that as a little bit of a cliffhanger. So what are the Arab countries doing at this point? Well, a couple of things are going on in the two main Arab countries that matter. And there's a map of the Bar-Lev line. This is also kind of how, and it was, listen, it's a very extensive thing. It goes all the way down along that east coast of the Suez Canal. It's a lot of fortifications, and there it is. And you can see this is no small effort. As small as Israel is compared to some other countries, that's a major area to protect. For those of you who know about what's going on at our southern border, the idea of really blockading it is really difficult. Not along its entire length, it's actually not feasible. But of course, you can fortify the areas that are most susceptible. Meanwhile, so what's going on in the two countries that really matter, Egypt and Syria? Well, in 1970 is a really important year for those two countries. First is you have Hafez al-Assad in Syria, and I have his picture a little bit. We can skip to his picture just for a second, link number 7. Hafez al-Assad takes control of the Ba'ath Party. And the Ba'ath Party isn't just a party in power in Syria, it's a real nationalist, not so religious party that's dominant in both Syria and Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a Ba'ath Party leader as well, by the way. And Assad takes over the Ba'ath Party. He kind of basically engineers a little bit of a coup, and he becomes the leader of Syria. So that's what happens there. In Egypt, though, we have something else going on. Nasser, who had been the leader of Egypt during the 56 war and the 67 war, has passed away. He died of a brain tumor, I believe. I know he had a brain cancer. And Anwar el-Sadat becomes the president. You can go to pic number 4. Picture, yeah, you see what you scroll down that, you'll see some earlier pictures of him as a young man. Career military guy, very respected in the Egyptian military, probably a little bit more respected for his abilities than Nasser was, but he just wasn't as much of a magnetic personality to the other troops. He wasn't unpopular, but he wasn't a firebrand. He was considered to be more cerebral and an interesting guy nonetheless. So not only has he taken over Egypt, but he starts sending out some types of messages that he may be interested in some kind of peace with Israel. Starting at the end of 1970, he starts doing this. And it's hard to tell exactly if he really meant it or not. Basically, the offer was, give us back the Sinai, give us back the Gaza Strip, and we'll sign a peace treaty, or we'll sign at least a non-aggression pact with Israel. And the US buys it. Israel doesn't really buy it. And so they don't really move forward with it. And the United States is angry at the time. President Nixon, and well, not so much President Nixon, but the State Department is upset with it. At that time, the Secretary of State is William Rogers. Henry Kissinger, right at that time, is still just the National Security Advisor. But pretty much the diplomatic corps in the United States is a little upset with Israel for not embracing Sadat. This is a debate that still goes on today, whether Sadat was really serious about a peace agreement or not, and whether Israel's rejection of it brought him to war. I think that what happens during the war and what happens during the years between 1970 and 73 it lead me to believe that Sadat wasn't completely serious, that Sadat needed to prove that he was a tough guy without being too foaming at the mouth like Nasser was to the Egyptian military and to the Arab world. And I don't think he was really ready for peace until some lessons were handed to him, both during and after the Yom Kippur War. But there's a good argument to be made that he was serious about it, and Israel just rejected it. Also leading up to the war is another very, very interesting footnote in history for a lot of people, although I think it's a really important lesson to learn because it's the second time in my study of history that you see something like this happen, where you have intelligence that tells you one thing, and the establishment of the military says this can't be true, so we're not believing it, and gold given to you on a silver platter intelligence is ignored. And in the case of Egypt and the Yom Kippur War, Israel had intelligence handed to them on a silver platter by a guy named Ashraf Marwan. And he is also there. Ashraf, there he is, his picture. Ashraf Marwan, why is he an important guy? He's an Egyptian scientist who just happens to be the son-in-law of Nasser. That's his wedding picture there as he's marrying one of Nasser's daughters. And this guy was basically a spy for everyone. Sometimes he worked for the Egyptians as a spy. Sometimes he seems to have worked for the Israelis as a spy, maybe for the British. He was all over the place, very, very ambitious. In fact, Nasser, before he died and before the wedding, was always suspicious of him and really felt like this guy might really be marrying my daughter to get himself ingratiated into power. Turns out Nasser was right. Marwan gives to the Israelis in May and June of 1973 intelligence that the Egyptians are not just doing war games along the Suez, but they're going to invade. And the Israelis don't really believe him. And then, of course, in May, they don't invade. And then again in October, just before the war, he tells them this again. So they sort of discount it. But understand that when he tells them this, he's not just on the phone saying, hey, I think they're going to do this. He's handing over documents. He's handing over hard evidence. But because the Israeli military establishment had assessed in their routine assessment reports that Egypt couldn't really mount this kind of invasion, they discount him. And they lose a couple of days worth of advance notice on the war. This is very similar to me than the famous story during World War II. In the days leading up to the Battle of the Bulge, for those of you who know your history, the Allies, thanks to the British, had already captured the British Enigma machine. The Nazi Enigma machine, their code, their secret code basically deciphered. And the Enigma machine, the geniuses at Bletchley Park in Britain had intercepted a number of messages saying that the Germans were planning a major counterattack in Belgium. This is the lead up to the Battle of the Bulge. And the Pentagon and the American military establishment looked at it and said, nah, this has to be a decoy. We've assessed in our report from 30,000 miles in the sky that Germany doesn't have the ability to do such a thing. And of course, that was wrong. So it's one of those things where you can have all the information. You can have the best agents in the world, but you have to have an establishment that's willing to be wrong about something. And you also have to have an establishment that isn't so interested in reports. For those of you who have ever done government work or work in certain kinds of corporations, reports for a lot of people are their entire career. They don't necessarily do anything productive, but they have a lot of reports that they wrote. And you get really married to it. I mean, think of that first term paper that you wrote in college that you thought you did really well with, and you don't want anyone editing it, and you're in love with it. And if you're a novel writer or a book writer, you know that writing is rewriting. And once you get to that point where you're willing to be humble enough to fix mistakes, you're going to do much better in life, and certainly as a writer, and in this case, in the military. So that's where we are at this point. The one thing you need to know, to add one more thing about where Israel is at this point, Israel is also reluctant to act on the Marwan intelligence because they have decided that politically, they don't want to be the people who strike first again, like they did in the '67 war. Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, who's the defense minister at the time, believed that they got away with one in '67. They knew that the United States really didn't want Israel to strike first, and Israel felt that they had to. And they felt like they almost had to pay a huge political price for it. Luckily, Israel won so resoundingly. The world was behind them. The jerks in the State Department who hated Israel didn't have much of a leg to stand on. So there you go. So the issue there is the Israelis are already starting with a little bit of a hand behind their back. They don't want to strike first. And so this is a bit of intelligence that they don't want. This is not the intelligence report they want to hear. They don't want to hear something where it would compel them to strike first because they just don't want to do that. So they're willing to roll the dice as they did in May and wait. October 6th comes around, it's Yom Kippur. Now, and the Egyptians launch a major offensive across the Suez. And they do some really ingenious things. to cross the Suez. One of the things they do is they build quickly pontoon bridges to help them cross the Suez and get their tanks across. But then what about the Bar-Lev line and those massive, massive, steep sand dunes that the Israelis had amassed to cover and made it really, really hard for humans and or tanks to get across? What about that? What did they do with that? And they did something really ingenious there too. They brought out a bunch of water cannons and they sprayed the sand dunes really heavily, which created more traction for the Egyptian troops to march up those dunes, and almost like a step effect, because they basically shoot a tiered level kind of like natural staircase, and it really, really works. And the other thing they do is they have massive, massive numbers, hundreds, more than 100,000 troops crossing that into the Sinai at that moment. And it catches the Israelis by surprise, not only because it's Yom Kippur, when the country is kind of a little bit sleepier in some ways. I'll talk about how it may have been a bad idea for the Egyptians to, in many ways also. It basically was a mixed bag. There were some advantages they got for attacking on Yom Kippur, and there was some disadvantages. But the advantage is that, at least it seems from the Egyptian standpoint, that the word may not get out too well to Israelis because they're home or they're in the synagogue, and they may not be able to get their reserves up in time as quickly as possible. That turned out to be sort of the other way around, because what happened was, first of all, you had a lot of people all in one place. People weren't at their job here, there, and spread all over the country. A lot of them were in synagogue or they were at home listening to the radio. So they were able to find out, they actually got the word out better. And second of all, as far as heavy traffic in the streets were quiet. So you were able to get people on buses, and they had no traffic to get through to get down to the front to Egypt pretty quickly. So in some ways, attacking on Yom Kippur was a mistake. And I think from a political standpoint, or from an optics standpoint, it was bad also. It really looked like you're picking on the Jews on a bad day. It got a lot of Jews motivated, and a lot of rabbis, especially rabbis on the West Coast in the United States, and who came to synagogue that day already knowing what was happening. If you were on the East Coast, you found out maybe during, I want to say Unatana Tokef time, around that time. So you had a lot of people, you had rabbis able to say what was going on in Israel, let's focus our prayers, that kind of thing. So, again, a mixed bag, but that is when they attacked. And the Egyptians have tremendous early success. So keeping it to military stuff, as I said, they get these pontoon bridges built. They use water cannon to get up the sand dunes. And they start to advance against very, very overmatched Israeli positions. Now, this is when we get to the Bar-Lev line. Defense is, since the Yom Kippur War, no country has ever put together another Maginot line or Bar-Lev line kind of thing, because the inherent weakness of a static defensive line has been clearly proven. You got to be moving around. You need mobility. And we'll talk about the difference between the Bar-Lev line in the south and what Israel's defenses were in the north in just a moment. They were much better. When you have a defensive line that is staying in place, the enemy always knows where to go. Even if it's hard to get through, at least they know that things aren't, it can't move. It's there. You've built this wall. You've built this defensive line, and it's not all about resources there. It's basically, resources that you can add, resources that you can move around. They can't adjust. And so that was the end of that kind of military strategy, not only for Israel, but for the rest of the world. You've never heard about anything like that ever again. Not from you have people who want to build barriers to non-armies, fence in a country or fence out, people like that, but not like something like that, not like something for military. So they get a tremendous advantage in the early, and so what do the Israelis do? Like I said, the Israelis actually don't scramble their reserves badly. They get the reserves there pretty quickly, but then they're met by the second really smart thing that the Egyptians do. The Egyptians are ready for the reserves to come in. They're ready for more tanks to come in from Israel, and they're ready for more jets to come in from Israel. Here we can take a look at picture number 8 for a second. I want to skip to number 8. This is a list and a graphic of all the major jets that were used by both sides in the Yom Kippur War. Rabbi, if you can go to picture number 8 on the links. Yeah, here we go. If you scroll down there, you'll see still mostly French jets. The Israelis are not working with F-16s or F-14s at the time, nothing like that. Mostly French jets. There's a couple of American jets in their arsenal. And the Egyptians and the Syrians are working with MiGs, the Russian stuff. So the French made, and Israeli altered jets come in. Nice response by the reserves. They're coming down to this emergency, doing a really nice job, and they're sitting ducks for Egyptian SAM missiles. SAM stands for surface to air missiles. They're on the ground, they're ready for them, and a lot of Israeli jets are lost during this, what was supposed to be a counterattack or a repelling action to push the Egyptians back. And then the tanks are picked off by new tactics that they had not seen before. The Israeli tanks, and all tanks had been built for that time to fight other tanks. And what do the Egyptians do? The Egyptians use guys using RPGs, or some people call them bazookas, just regular infantry, not in a tank, very mobile, able to move around their target, and they're picking off the Israeli tanks with these RPG bazookas, and they're causing heavy damage. So the Israelis are A, surprised in the south, and B, the initial pushback attempt is thwarted by some really good Egyptian strategy. And so at that point, the Egyptians are about 10 miles into the Sinai, and they decide to stop there, which isn't a bad idea. They figured that this will be enough for them to recapture the Sinai. Sadat's plan is not to conquer Israel and take over Jerusalem. We found this out later. There was no way to know that at the time. He wants to reconquer the Sinai and Gaza and get this great victory for himself and establish himself that way. And he's happy with it. So he's going to wait. He waits at that point, 10 miles from the Suez, 10 miles from the Suez, east from the Suez. The Israelis are really reeling at this point. And at the same time, of course, you go to the north and you have Assad's army, mostly with tanks, coming in. And at some points attacking the Golan Heights, at some points in time during that attack, the Israeli tank forces are outnumbered by 5, 6, up to 11 to 1 at some point. So they really have, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Syrian tanks and just several dozen Israeli tanks to meet them. But what's the difference there? What's the difference there compared to what happened in Egypt? First of all, the Israelis don't have these big fortifications built with walls and sand dunes and everything else like that in the north. For one thing, it's not a desert. It's a very fertile area. In fact, that area to the north of Israel, the Golan Heights, and then further north to that, the Bekaa Valley, have been such fertile areas for so many thousands of years that there actually been a lot of wars and a lot of kingdoms that were based on having control of that area. Huge thing in the Middle East to be in control of the Bekaa Valley. Not the least a rich reason is that's where hashish is grown and always been a big cash crop. So it's very fertile. And the Israelis do a couple of things there that were much smarter during the war and then before the war and then again during the war. First is they create minefields all over the area to create a bottleneck. So no matter how many tanks the Syrians have, they can't run in columns of 10, 20, 30 at a time and just overrun. They've all got to go through, think of that tight intersection that you got to go through every night when you're driving home or something like that, that bottleneck. Yeah, you can show that number 6, right? And the second thing that the Israelis do is they have mobile artillery units. This is the opposite of the Bar-Lev line. They have mobile artillery units that can jab and weave, bob and weave, jab, stick and weave, and stick and move, and really hit these Egyptian tanks at any time. Now, as great as all the things I just talked about, you're still talking about at some points 11 to 1 advantage to the Syrian tanks. But the Israelis do so well, and there's so many real individual heroic stories about what happens there. And so they create something because of the minefields that create that bottleneck. It actually has a name. It's called the Valley of Tears. It's something that the Israelis named because that was really where the Syrian army was majorly defeated. They created a bottleneck. They had stick and move artillery that's able to pick the Syrian tanks off, in some cases, one by one. And there were a number of Israeli tank platoons that went above and beyond the call. There was one second lieutenant who he and his tank group held off the whole Syrian army for a couple of hours. It's an incredible story. It's kind of like that, it's kind of like the story of the 300 at Thermopylae. It's just incredible. So those are the things that's going on in the north. Now, meanwhile, by the way, some of you might be asking, what happened to Jordan? Jordan was one of the countries that attacked during the 6-Day War. And in usual style, King Hussein, always late to the party and always makes the wrong move, decides to sit this one out. If he doesn't sit it out and the Israelis have a 3-front war to worry about, maybe they don't win this war, who knows? But he sits it out, but he only sits it out for a little while. He waits until the worst moment after this incredible victory by the Israelis, this incredible defeat of the Syrian army, the Syrian tanks, that's when he gets involved and sends Jordanian. He combines the Jordanian. He combines the Jordanian and Iraqi. They decide to get together in a joint Jordanian Iraqi tank units come into, and they try to flank Israel's tank battalions that are along that northern border. And there's no surprise, because I guess he kind of announced it before it happened, and the Israelis absolutely wiped them out. And also similar to what happened during the 6-Day War when the Egyptians remember I talked about last time, the Egyptians were given functional command of the Jordanian army, and they didn't understand each other, and they hadn't trained with one another, and they were unfamiliar. They make the same mistake again. The Iraqis and the Jordanian tank forces didn't know each other, weren't friendly. By that time in the Arab world, there's a lot of dislike for Hussein anyway, King Hussein in Jordan I'm talking about. And so that just fails miserably. So that's where we are. And it seems like we're in a good shape where, it seems like things have stopped. And that's what the Israelis decide they need to push on further to the north. And this is a major, major strong decision. This is, again, the Israeli successes up to this point are individual heroism, the success of the northern defenses with those minefields creating the Valley of Tears, and just, again, a lot of holding out against all odds. Now they start to make smart strategic decisions. And the decision to push on and to get close to Damascus after this defeat of the Syrian advance is a crucial, positive, good decision for the Israeli military. The reason being, it puts tremendous pressure on Assad. The Israelis start to move forward and forward. The Air Force now has already been able to knock out all of the Syrians' air defenses, and the Israeli Air Force is now indiscriminately bombing lots of parts of Syria. And their artillery batteries are within firing distance of Damascus. And this forces Assad to call for help. And who does he call for help? He only has one person to ask, and that's Sadat in Egypt. And he says, listen, you guys need to mount an offensive right now because the entire Israeli army knows that you guys aren't advancing. And so I need you guys to push forward in the south so that the Israelis need to refocus their efforts to the south, and you take the heat off of me. Now, the Egyptian generals down in the south are thinking, no way, we've already won this war. If we just stay here, we're going to be able to negotiate control of the Sinai. We don't want to stay. We don't want to move. And not only do they not want to move because they've already kind of won what they set out to win, they're very, very safely protected by Egyptian air cover and some of their anti-aircraft batteries. If they move further north into the Sinai or further west into the Sinai, they get out of their security blanket. They get out of their dome of protection. But Sadat, very foolishly, listens to Assad and decides to help him out. So I have a big fan here. So he does move forward. And on October 13th, they start to move forward. The Egyptians start to move forward, and this is exactly the break that the Israelis were waiting for, in particular, General Ariel Sharon, who's waiting for them to move out of this protective area. And that's when something called the Battle of the Chinese Farm starts. It's called the Battle of the Chinese Farm because part of the Bar-Lev line were all these little storage sheds, like those aluminum storage sheds where you sometimes see a small airplane or something like that, that were shipped actually from Japan. They have a bunch of Japanese characters on it, but a bunch of Jewish boys from Israel, what do they know? So they thought it was Chinese, and they called it the Chinese Farm because there were some parts of the Sinai Desert that were relatively fertile, and a lot of these were placed in that area. And in the beginning, as much as the Egyptians have given up a huge tactical advantage by moving away from their air cover, they're still very hardened troops at this point. They've done very well. The first day or so of the Battle of the Chinese Farm is brutal. A lot of Israelis, a lot of Egyptians dead. Absolutely, completely brutal, a lot of death. And there's a very interesting story about that. There were so many dead soldiers lying next to each other and injured soldiers, and you didn't know who was who. And in Israel at the time, there used to be a joke. Some of you might remember it used to be like, people would say, well, France is a nice country, but it's tough to be a Jew in France. Or, Germany is a nice country, but it's tough to be a Jew in Germany. And when times were difficult in Israel, when there was an economic problem where you couldn't get the thing you wanted at the store, or something went wrong, the joke was, yeah, it's tough to be a Jew in the land of Israel. Ha, ha, ha. So that was a joke that was very common in Israel. Everyone made that joke. It was kind of like the national joke. And as the reinforcement troops came to see some of the dead and wounded along the battlefield, Sharon told them, like, listen, you don't know if they're Egyptian or Israeli. You got to ask them if they're Israeli or not. You got to ask them in Hebrew and hope they'll answer you. And there's a very famous story of one badly injured soldier who, as he's approached by Israeli troops, they ask him, "Are you an Israeli?" And he says in Hebrew, "Yeah." And it's tough to be a Jew in the land of Israel. So I mean, it's one of those things like where stories in World War II when they wanted to make sure you were an American, they'd ask you who won the World Series and things like that. Like that was the perfect answer. But that I tell that story not only to get a laugh, but also just to remind you how brutal that war was. And I think that on Yom Kippur, obviously this happened a week after Yom Kippur, but if there's any battle that you need to think of, and there were a lot of brutal battles, a lot of Israelis died in the Syrian front, and obviously a lot of Israelis in the beginning of that invasion on October 6th died. But for sheer brutality and carnage, the first day or so, the Battle of the Chinese Farm is something that I like to think about on Yom Kippur, to kind of get me in a more serious mood. Try to remember those guys who fought in that battle, and the Egyptians too. I mean, just incredible carnage in that battle. But it eventually really turns the Israelis' way, again, because the Egyptians had lost their air cover. I want to show you another picture right now, because there was another tactical problem that the Egyptians ran into in that battle. What picture is this? I got to find the right picture. This is picture number 9, and then we're going to do a picture number 10. The Israelis used in the Battle of the Chinese Farm a tank called the Centurion tank. And this is picture number 9. And I want you to notice something about the picture when you see it. That's the Centurion tank right there. You'll notice it's got a big gun on it, but it's not like, look how it's pointed. It's kind of at a sharper angle. This would prove to be very, very crucial. And they were up against the Egyptians who had a Soviet T-55 tank. That's number 10. Let's look at number 10. And here you see the Soviet T-55 tank. That's not a gun that they've jacked up. That's the resting position of that gun. It's much bigger and it points higher. For those of you who are good at geography or playing Jenga or whatever, you'll understand what the problem is here. As you're going over high sand dunes in the desert, and you've got this thing pointing at this higher angle, you present a huge target, a very visible target for other tanks and for aircraft. It's a lot easier to see. The Israeli tank that has its gun pointing much further down and is shorter is much harder to pinpoint. And so the Israeli tanks, as they move over some of these hills and dunes in the Sinai Desert, are almost invulnerable. They're really hard to see. They're really hard to see from anything other than point blank range. And the Egyptian T-35 Soviet tanks are really easy to see. So at some point, you get this crazy situation where the number of Egyptian tanks, you had about 5. So this is a battle. The Battle of the Chinese Farm begins with 500 tanks basically on the Israeli side and 500 tanks on the Egyptian side. A day and a half later, the Egyptians had lost 260 of their 500 tanks, and the Israelis had lost 10. So this is a major turning point, and obviously it emboldens Sharon even further. He uses a top secret, and by the way, it's still top secret, I can't find a picture of it, contraption that allows basically is a movable bridge that the Israelis are able to use to cross the Suez Canal and to start to flank the Egyptians from Egyptian territory, not from the nation of Egypt, not the Sinai. The Israelis get massive numbers of troops and tanks over to that side. They still have a lot of their troops and tanks on the other side, and they encircle the entire Egyptian army. And of course, that's a major turning point. Meanwhile, what happened in Syria? I talked about how Assad wanted the Egyptians to move forward so they could take the heat off of him. What was going on in Syria at that time, a little bit before the Battle of the Chinese Farm, were a couple of things. One of you asked me last week or 2 weeks ago about the Israeli Navy. This was the greatest victory for the Israeli Navy of all time. As soon as the Israeli Air Force started to get its supremacy there, the Israelis still had a problem with Syrian naval ships. They were able to shell the Israeli positions from the decks of those ships. And so the Israelis scramble some of their naval ships, and there's the first ever missile-to-missile naval battle in the history of the world, and the Israelis completely win that one, similar to what Battle of the Chinese Farm, similar numbers. The Israelis basically have no major losses of their ships, and they basically totally knock out the Syrian Navy. So that's where you are, and that's where basically the war kind of ends. You have the Syrians you have the Egyptians in the south who now are forced basically to surrender, for lack of a better term. There's no real official surrender agreement, although they do have a signing in the middle of the night in the desert. But it isn't you don't have Sadat saying, we're retreating. And of course, then the world powers rush in. A couple of things that I want to talk about just before I wrap this up and open up to questions. Again, obviously, I was really covering highlights. I did not have a day-to-day for you because that would take too long. But these are the major strategic points of the war. Obviously, starting out really well for Egypt and pretty well for the Syrians, and then the things that turn the tide. Two things that I didn't mention that also turned the tide was the fact, and I mentioned this in some of the previous lectures, the Israelis are really gaining an upper hand, but they've lost a lot of their material. I mean, they've lost a lot of jets, they've lost a lot of tanks. And President Nixon decides to deliver then, or at least promise to deliver, which is just as important sometimes in war, because it gave the Israelis, a major shot in the arm internationally, to say, hey, I'm not giving you extra supplies. We're not trying to help a war go on, but that shipment that you were expecting in 3-4 months, we're going to send it to you now. And so that resupply was, I think, one of the most important moments in Middle East history, because it really sent a message to the world, but especially Anwar Sadat, that the United States would never abandon Israel, and that they would take major risks to do so. What was the risk here? The risk here was that the Soviets would be enraged by this, that they too would resupply the Arab armies, and they would also maybe even scramble some of their assets in Europe to threaten the United States there. And we reached one of the highest levels of, we reached a very high DEFCON level. Almost, I think we got to DEFCON 3 or something at that point. Very, very dangerous position. In retrospect, though, the discussion about how the Yom Kippur War could have started a nuclear war and ended the world, we realize now that was a little exaggerated for a couple of reasons. First reason being what I talked about last time. Starting with the Sinai campaign, but certainly by the Six-Day War, the Soviets really look at the Arabs as total fodder. They're not really treating them like allies. They aren't going to go too out on the line for them. And again, they prove it during the Yom Kippur War because they're not rushing their supplies to the Egyptians or the Syrians. They're willing to do so, but they're not going to move up the dates like the United States does. And it just, again, the Soviets, like the czarist governments before that, are content to cause mischief. They don't really care about the Arab people. They don't really care about the Arab cause. They just like the fact that it occupies the United States. To some degree, it occupies the British and the French, and it bothers them and annoys them. And as long as that happens, they're okay with it. They're not willing to make any more risks. So yes, the Soviet fleet moved into those areas where the Syrian Navy had been totally destroyed, but they did so just to keep the ports open and to keep the economy open. They didn't scramble their resources to Egypt. And so Sadat realizes that A, the United States is never going to stand by Israel, and B, the Soviets can't really be trusted. And to me, that's proof in retrospect that he was serious about the war and wasn't really serious about peace beforehand, because those are the two things that really got him towards the path to peace. That's when he realizes, look, we can't rely on the Soviets, and the Israelis can rely on the United States. We don't fit in too well into this equation. If you can't beat him, join him. And of course, 4 years later, he makes that historic visit to Jerusalem, and the rest is history. Very, very, very interesting, by the way, that we're talking about Anwar Sadat right now. If you know the news last week, Ayman al-Zawahiri was killed by the United States. And Ayman al-Zawahiri, had a very, we know him as the guy who really planned 9/11. He was much more involved with it and responsible for it than Osama bin Laden. Of course, he was responsible too. But well before 9/11, Ayman al-Zawahiri was already the world's worst terrorist. His big claim to fame was he was one of the major players in the assassination of Anwar Sadat in 1981. And he also had something to do with the assassination of Benazir Bhutto. He was behind the bombings of U.S. embassies and areas in Nigeria and Tanzania. The USS Cole. I mean, he had a really, really long rap sheet before 9/11. He was already the worst before 9/11, if you can imagine. So you talk about somebody like Anwar Sadat. I really think I really think his family and his support, people who supported his pragmatism. I'm not calling him a saint, but pragmatism got a little justice last week. And then, the reverberations in Israel are very important. Obviously, the war was a tremendous testament to Israeli ingenuity and ability to roll with the punches. But it was a scandal that Israel was caught off guard that way. And something was convened after the war called the Agranat Commission. And you can take a look. That's my last picture. A picture of Shimon Agranat, who was the chief justice of the Israeli Supreme Court. So this is like Israel's Warren Commission. Earl Warren was the chief justice after the Kennedy, during the Kennedy assassination, and he had a commission that looked into it. Agranat did the same thing. And of course, this is the political obituary for Golda Meir. The full report didn't come out until 1975, but the preliminary report came out much sooner than that. It came out in early 1974. And it really, really indicted in many ways both Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, but put most of the responsibility on the commanders, especially some of the commanders in the South, not Ariel Sharon, obviously. And it's still, to this day, very, very controversial in Israel, because as bad as it was for Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, who both ended up losing their positions in the government from that, the fact is a lot of people felt that those generals were faulted too much. That really was people like Golda Meir's fault. One, for not trying to negotiate a peace. Two, for not being willing to strike first. Three, for ignoring the intelligence information, the whole thing. And so, that government fell, and it led to Yitzhak Rabin becoming prime minister for a while. And then really, it was really the beginning of the Likud eventually becoming the dominant party in Israel for quite a long time, because in 1977, when they finally had a real full election, the first one since the Yom Kippur War, he wins a big victory. So that's where Israel is at the end of the war. Obviously, the most casualties of any war they fought. It's still very controversial in Israel. The losses were very, very deep and very, very scary. But it also had some really, really good results, not the least of which that it convinces Sadat to try to make peace. And it ends the conventional warfare era, which is not all good news, but a lot of it is good news. That Israel never really had to worry again about amassing of 1 million troops in total on 3 different fronts ever again. So that's where we are at the end of that conventional warfare era, at the end of the Yom Kippur War. And again, I would say that the key things to remember here was the intelligence failure, or actually the intelligence success, the political failure, the initial failures of the Bar-Lev line for many obvious reasons and some ingenious reasons, the incredible counterattack that happened and heroism that happened in the north, and the incredible push forward to the north, the really, really smart decision to really pressure Assad into asking for help, which took the Egyptians out of that comfort zone and allowed the Israelis to come out of that war without any territory lost. And now I'll open it up to questions.
Okay, you have the ability to unmute yourselves if you want, or you can raise your hand and I can call on you, but I have returned the ability to unmute. Any questions, Neil, you want to start off?
Sure. I have a lot of questions about this one. So in the Sinai, they had the anti-tank weapons. I always thought these were like shoulder-mounted, anti-tank, like the U.S. military uses. They were guided. But what was it? Once they got out of their comfort zone, the troops with the anti-tank missiles just couldn't keep up?
Right. This is something that I remember in the classes I took in college about military history and tactics, this was really an example that they really, really looked at. This is really interesting. And by the way, there's a modern iteration of this with drones. We talk about tanks and we look at tanks and things like that. Tanks have to have support from people outside the tank. In other words, there need to be troops not far from the tank, and you need to have some kind of air cover. Otherwise, tanks don't really move that fast. So, with your Air Force, you can pick them off. And the same is true for people with shoulder-mounted RPGs or bazookas, whatever you want to call them. They're just humans. They don't, you can hit them with small arms and knock them out. But as long as they were in that comfort zone with the Egyptian air cover, you couldn't get them. As soon as they moved out of that area, the Israelis were able to move their Air Force in and bombed the heck out of all the land positions there. And they got rid of that in a very short time. They got rid of all the guys with the shoulder mounted weapons that way. The modern iteration of this is that one of the big reasons why required military service in Israel has become much shorter. Used to be 4 years for men and 2 years for women. It is now less than 3 years for men, and not the least of which the reason is because of drones. Now you can use drones to give tanks the kind of air cover and support that they didn't have before. And that saves a lot of manpower. Israel's manpower needs, the actual like men in the field, and in some cases women, is much less than it once was because of that. So yeah, they moved out of their comfort zone. It allowed the Israeli jets to just, all they needed to do was just indiscriminately bomb. I mean, like a bomb goes off, sometimes within several hundred yards, and you're going to knock out the human targets. And they didn't have bunkers or anything there, so they were sitting ducks.
And how did the Israeli Air Force, because as I understood it, the big surprise was that Egypt and Syria both had anti-aircraft missiles. How were they able to I thought they never were able to neutralize them, and the Air Force had to fly high to prevent down.
Yeah, so what they did was that they did something. Now, with the Egyptians, they didn't have as many SAM, but they had enough SAM missiles to stop that initial counter push that I talked about. After that, they kind of ran out of it. I remember Sadat was looking for that resupply and never got it. How did they take out the Syrian anti-aircraft missiles? And that was a brilliant maneuver. Now, at first, they figured flying low enough would knock them out, but it didn't work. And so then they tried something else. Again, because Jordan wasn't involved in the war, the Jordanian front was open. So the Israelis were able to come through from Jordan, fly over Jordan, and flank those SAM missile batteries that the Syrians had from behind. As you know, they're not like movable. They're kind of stuck in one position, and they can move left and right a little bit, but they can't turn around. So the Israelis got them from behind, and that's how they took them out. They flew even lower than they thought they could safely, but they did it anyway, and they came in from Jordan and flanked them, which was, again, only made possible by the fact that Jordan wasn't even manning their anti-aircraft guns at the time.
And when Sharon flanked the, because I mean, to me, that was like the brilliance of the Sinai. I mean, this made Ariel Sharon so famous. They went from both the north and the south to get around the Egyptian military, right?
Well, they also went through the middle. The Egyptian military was stretched very, very thin. And so he found the weak spot in the middle there. And that also was a place where they did a crossing. So it was stretched too thin. This was an offensive war, and they suddenly became sedentary and stuck in one position, and then they became vulnerable that way.
I remember watching some video. Literally, the Egyptians were so shocked that they got on the other side of the Suez Canal that they all surrendered right away because they just couldn't understand how the Israelis were there.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I said, there are no pictures because it's still a secret of the contraption that the Israelis had to create like a movable bridge. But if you read the books by Herman Wouk, The Hope and the Glory, it's a 2-part book. And obviously, it's a fictionalized version of history. But there's a long chapter where he talks about it, and clearly someone described this contraption to him very vividly. So it's probably the best description of that contraption. So it's in the second book, The Glory. I would highly recommend it. It's a good book.
Now we have a question from Georgia Kent.
Jake, you mentioned that there was some hyperbole and discussion and fear that this might elevate into a nuclear situation. Now, just my assumption, and I don't know if it's right or not, you have to tell me, is that the nukes we're talking about were from Russia and the US. And where was Israel in that part of things at that point in time? I'm assuming they don't have them now, but I'm assuming that they really didn't have them then, or is that not the right assumption?
Not far from Pittsburgh, in 1969, some plutonium went missing at a weapons grade power plant. I think it was not far from Allentown. So pretty far from Pittsburgh. It was somewhere in the Alleghenies, actually not Allentown, so pretty close to Pittsburgh. It is widely believed that the Israelis stole it. And by 1973, they did have
Uh-huh.
at least one or two nuclear weapons. Whether they were ready to be affixed to a jet, obviously they didn't have an ICBM, they didn't have that kind of missile capacity, is probably not. It probably was something that they could have, like almost like a dirty bomb. And there are all kinds of, there's a big debate in history. Golda Meir made at one point a statement about how they have kind of a last resort plan. A lot of people feel like, oh, that's the code that they did have a nuclear weapon, but you never know. I don't think we're ever going to know that. That's not one of those things like we're in 50 years, they're going to unseal the document. But I believe, based on my own study of it, that the Israelis probably had something akin to a dirty bomb at the time, which means that if they had really been overrun, what were they going to do? Like deliver it on a truck? I mean, maybe, yeah, it wouldn't have been good for tactical use in a military situation. So I think it's kind of a moot point. But absolutely, by 73, I think they had something pretty ready to go, but not for military use. Not yet. Something that they could put into missile form or fix to a jet wasn't ready yet.
Well, I want to interject on that point. That's an excellent question. The company was actually out in the Pittsburgh area. It was a company called Nucor, I believe was the name. And yeah, I mean, this has been one of these great mysteries of, what was going on with this company, because there was like enough uranium missing and nobody kind of knows what happened to it.
Yeah, it's kind of like Back to the Future. Somebody took the plutonium.
Right, I've got one other question, since I just wanted to ask you, but one of the things I've read about is in the Battle of the Golan Heights. I mean, it really was the troops that won it. The bravery and what I've read is the better skills. The tank gunnery was just simply better on the Israeli part.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of heroes. When I was working at the consulate, obviously, Memorial Day is a very, very big deal for the consulate, and in the United States, they do a service every year, and it's a lot of individual stories are told. We do a thing during the service where people come up and tell the story of their loved one who was killed, and there's so many of those stories from the Golan. A lot of just it really, they saved Israel, because unlike the Egyptians, who were really looking just to kind of retake the Sinai, it's hard to tell, but we don't really know where the Syrians would have stopped if they could have, if they hadn't been stopped. So, and I was talking about before, the stick and move work by, the initial response with those stick and move mobile artillery units, they knew they weren't going to do much other than to slow down the Syrian advance. They knew they weren't going to destroy them, and yet they still had at it for days at a time. So that took a lot of bravery, when you're like, what I do now today might just delay things for a few hours, but they were willing to risk their lives to do that.
Does anybody else have any other questions?
I think we're looking good. I'm looking around. This has been great. That's anyone who's been through, whether you like just tonight or the last four of them, unbelievable. Very great.
Jake, do you want to talk at all about where you're going next? Is this anything you want to tell us about, as far as something we should be looking for, or?
Well, I don't know. It's funny because they brought me in to fix things, and it's going to take me a long time before it's fixed. So don't judge me yet. But yeah, I'm going back to the TV news world. Wasn't sure I wanted to do that. This was one of the rare scenarios where I agreed to do it. I had always said I would go back if someone let me be in charge of all the content at a network. And that's what this network has done. It's a network called News Nation. For those of you who remember the old cable stations, it's the old WGN in Chicago, although they've split that into a number of stations. And it's a network that's trying to be down the middle. It's trying to report straight news, trying not to be partisan. I don't believe in that as much as I believe in just being better than the other stations. I'll tell you this. For those of you who think there are true believers on the right at Fox and true believers on the left at MSNBC and CNN, I have bad news for you. They don't believe in anything. It's the reason why you have so much partisanship in TV news is it's the easiest thing in the world to repeat partisan talking points. I've worked at all these places, and the number of true believers and people who are really informed is very low, zero, really. So I'm hoping to create just a smarter amount of content. It's on all the cable networks. This isn't a small network. This is a lot of money behind it. In fact, the company's stock is up this year, which not a lot of stocks can say. And they're making an effort to be smarter, be fairer, be different, and it's going to take a long time. I'm working with the staff of people who are coming from the industry as it exists, and even with their best intentions, they don't necessarily know how to be different. But we're going to make our effort on that. And one of the things I hope to do is what I consider to be regular coverage of Israel, not coverage of Israel only when it's attacked, not only negative coverage of Israel, just regular coverage. Sometimes it'll be positive, sometimes it'll be negative, depends on what's going on. And that's how you build trust. You can't just cheerlead, and you also can't just bash. That's kind of all we have right now. So I want to do something better than that.
Well, I wish you the best of luck. I think you should do an investigative reporting on the device they used to cross the Suez Canal. But if you ever want to do a story about a synagogue in Western Pennsylvania, well, you're hunting for the missing uranium, come and visit us. We'd love to have you. And I greatly appreciate this. I mean, seriously, I think everyone can say here we've learned a lot. And I feel I have a much better understanding of these wars, particularly the way you framed it. Has really helped me better understand what's happened. And I think we've all really benefited from this. So again, I know it's been an enormous amount of work on your part. I really appreciate it. And I really wish you best of luck.
Thank you.
And
one thing I didn't mention is, of course, Israel is just coming off of yet another attack, another operation. And one of the things that we see throughout is that, yes, you can have really great technology, but it has to be used properly, and you have to have the right strategy behind it. The Iron Dome, which is already legendary status, had an incredible, couple of days, 1,100 rockets fired from Islamic Jihad from Gaza. And this time there wasn't even a small casualty. All we had was a couple of cars damaged in Ashkelon. So it's become the envy of the world, and now the world really wants this technology. I mean, they already wanted it. The demand for this product is really, really high. I was surprised Raytheon stock didn't go through the roof today or on Friday. Today. So again, you see these kinds of things that you need to have some smarts behind it, and you also need to be able to continue to adjust. Whereas the Bar-Lev line was an old school, not adjusting type strategy. What they did in the north was very cutting edge. The combination of minefields and stick and move artillery was what saved a lot of Israel. And, if they had something like that in the south, it may have even, it may have helped keep that war from happening. So just remember, when you see technology like this, it makes a difference. What Israel has done to the F-35 and made it a much better weapon has turned it into, by far, the ultimate weapon in the universe. It is an incredible, weapon, and the Israelis have made it so much more of what it is. So things like that.
I will say personally, I think what I've learned the most is the will to win. It makes such a big difference. And I think what I've learned from these lectures is, the Ukrainians want to fight for their country. The Afghanis didn't. And certainly the Israelis wanted to fight for their country, and the Arabs really didn't. And I think that it tells you a lot, no matter what the technology is. All right, tell your wife we're going to let you run.
Okay.
All right, thanks again, Jake.
Bye, guys.
Really appreciate it. Best of luck.